This is a presentation on Marxist criticism as outlined in Peter Barry's book, Beginning Theory. The main work that launched this theory is Marx and Engels' The Communist Manifesto of 1848. Note their use of the term communist to refer to the theory and not the term used now, which is Marxist. Karl Marx is a German philosopher who in 1848 was expelled from Germany and lived in poverty in Britain as an exile. Friedrich Engels is a German sociologist who moved to Manchester in 1842 to work in his father's textile company. Marx met Engels when he, Marx, read an article for Engels in a magazine they both subscribed to. The gist of their manifesto is a call for a classless society based on the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Their philosophy is materialist, as in it thinks of the society we live in today, the world as it is today, the physical world, and not idealist, which looks for an example of a world that exists elsewhere. Marxists see history as class struggle rather than any other type of struggle, and that capitalism is a system whereby one class, often the worker class or the proletariat, is exploited by another class, the one with the money or the bourgeoisie. This exploitation results in the worker being alienated as they produce items that they cannot afford to buy. They become alien to their own body or their own hands, the hands that produced these goods, which also results in a process of reification where workers, humans, are seen as hands to the machine only. Marxist theory looks at the basic model of society to be made of a base, which is the material means of production, distribution, and exchange, and a superstructure, which is the cultural world of art, religion, and law. The premise in Marxism is that the superstructure is not free, but rather determined by the base. So our cultural world and this basic and early model of Marxism is determined by our material world. This is an older version of a Marxist look into society, and it has been developed later into a less forceful or direct relationship between base and superstructure, but it can help us look at the connection between literature and Marxism, especially as literature, being part of the superstructure, is both determined by economy, which is what the early models of Marxist theory thinks, but also as later models argue, also determines base or the basic modes of production. Now, Marx and Engels themselves are a product of society that values art, that reveres art and literature. In their society, art and literature had its own place, separate from society, separate from all the other works of society. So they didn't look at art as a work of art as, for example, propaganda, or as an example of base controlling superstructure. But Marxist literary criticism does argue that a writer's ideology determines their writing, and the class the writer belongs to in their philosophy determines how they write, whether in terms of the plot or the form of writing, from choice of genre to choice of words. Peter Barry writes that the Marxist sees writers as constantly formed by their social contexts in ways they themselves would usually not admit. This is their ideology or ideologies, and this is how it shows itself in their writing, with or without them being aware of it. This relates slightly to psychoanalytic theory, where the unconscious leads or controls our consciousness. This is similar, though generally a Marxist, especially early trends of Marxism, would not study the effects of the unconscious or the subconscious. They would not isolate the psyche or the individual from the social structures they live in. So, in this view, our social class or our ideology that is determined by our social class controls our writing without us directly causing this control, um, again, functioning in a similar way to the unconscious. But again, early strands of Marxism, especially those which Marx and Engels present in their very early work of the 19th century, and almost all the way to the 1970s, these works do not look into these issues or into specific historical situation. They are rather focused on the study of the conflict between different social classes. Attention to the specificity of certain historical situations and how ideologies affect writing came later, late 1970s, 1980s. The reaction to Marx and Engels in Russia right after the revolution was still mellow. Experimentation in art forms were encouraged by that time. But by the 1930s, the Soviet Union started exerting direct control over literature and the arts, especially in response to the writings of Lenin in 1905. Lenin has written that literature must become part of the organized, methodical, and unified labors of the Social Democratic Party. As a result, many works of literature were banned, among them the experimental works of Proust and Joyce, for example. So, with this, there developed two strands of Marxism: the Engelsian kind, which encourages freedom of art from political determinism, and the Leninist kind, which insists that art should serve the political cause of the left. This Leninist strand of Marxism also came to be called vulgar Marxism, as it sees a direct cause effect relation between literature and economy, where writers are almost trapped in their socio-economic position. Both forms of Marxism flourished side by side from the 1930s to around the 60s and the 70s. Now, Engelsian Marxism gave rise to a few strands of criticism that a lot of us are already aware of. Prior to the 1930s, Russian formalism was already alive and well till it was banned by the party for failing to serve the party's politics. Notable Russian formalists are Viktor Shklovsky, Boris Tomaszewski, and Boris Eichenbaum. They called for a close, formal reading of literature and its techniques, specifically with the focus that literature is not a mirror of reality per se. The most noteworthy of these techniques is defamiliarization, termed by Shklovsky. Defamiliarization is a technique used in literature aiming to make the familiar unfamiliar or strange. This distinction between reality and its representation in literature can also be seen in the way Tomaszewski distinguished between fabula, for example, or the events in the story itself, and plot, which is the artistic representation of these events. Linked to Shklovsky, Bertolt Brecht, a playwright, developed the alienation effect, where he intentionally adds to his theater devices that show the audience the clear split between reality and literature. So you see the director, for example, appearing on the stage. These ideas are also seen in other branches of formalist and Marxist theory, such as the Prague Linguistic School, founded by the linguist Roman Jakobson, the new critic René Wellick, who also insisted on the need for a close verbal analysis of literary text, and the Frankfurt School of Marxism that had for its members Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, and Theodor Adorno. More recent trends of Marxism are influenced by the French Marxist Louis Althusser. Althusser provides a framework for looking at base and superstructure, more digestible in its provision of some elements of independence and autonomy to the writer or the work of literature. Althusser developed the term over-determinism, to indicate the role of various effects in determining our actions or our ideologies, thus giving art a degree of independence from economic forces or a relative autonomy, which questions and negates the earlier strands of Marxism that see that the superstructure is entirely determined by the economic base. The term ideology is widely used by Althusser specifically to indicate a system of representations endowed with an existence and a historical role at the heart of a given society, which gives culture a more heightened status than the earlier one in which it was shaped by the base, and sees it as a main tool in creating the values of a society, thus decentering the role of the economic base as the mere factor that moves culture and belief, while at the same time giving literature some degree of freedom from the economic base. To further clarify his position, Althusser explained that states or governments use two types of methods to promote their ideas and ideologies. The direct method is RSA, or repressive state apparatuses, tools basically, repressive state tools such as the police, the army, and the prison. These are the tools used by force to enforce certain behaviors and prohibit others. Althusser says governments also use the ideological state apparatuses or ideological tools, which is the use of schools and churches, family structures, and art to also spread its ideology, its belief, its system. This second apparatus, the ideological state apparatus, is directly related to another important Marxist term, which is hegemony. The term hegemony is developed by Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. He distinguished between rule, which is the direct use of force by governments, and hegemony, which is defined in our book as the internalized form of social control, which makes certain views seem natural or invisible so that they hardly seem like views at all, just the way things are. This is done, according to Althusser again, through the process of interpellation, a trick that makes us feel like we are free agents when in reality we are controlled, we are interpellated or called upon and targeted specifically by the system to adhere to its applied or adopted ideologies. The importance of this move from the straightforward view of base controlling superstructure to the analysis of how ideologies are formed through a variety of forces, both repressive and ideological, is that literature now is no longer just passively controlled by the base. It is actually a tool that forms ideologies and shapes them. Marxist literary criticism is an adaptation of all these concepts and ideas into the study of literature. A Marxist literary critic can look at the overt and covert meanings of the same text, attempting to make the covert or the hidden one focused on the Marxist themes. So they study the overt, the surface meanings, to dig out the hidden meaning, the covert meanings which relate to Marxist themes. They relate the work to the social class of its author. They look at the genre and its relation to the social period. So the novel is seen to have developed in the late 18th century as a result of the expansion of the middle class at that time who can read. They relate the work to the social assumption of the reader that it targets in a specific era. They politicize literary forms and find them to be determined by political circumstances, such as realism, for example, having been determined by early Marxism. As an example, the book provides a Marxist reading of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. The reading comes from another critic called Krieger. The critic looks at the different classes of characters and tries to determine the initial or the overt meaning of the play, which is, in this case, a play that recommends a balance in decorum. In analyzing the characters and the final outcome of the play, the critic argues that the sense of decorum has only been afforded to the higher classes, and the lower classes are left with no venue to reach it. The sense of decorum, which was the overt purpose of the play, or what the play puts out to the reader. The argument then is that the play is blind to how certain social expectations are not afforded to all classes. So the sense of decorum that the play tries to push forth is not afforded to all classes. It ignores the different forms of behaviors enabled in each class. The critic then exposed the covert ideas hidden behind the surface meaning to be those that distinguish between the different classes and what each is afforded. Tied to this, the reading, or this critical reading, shows how the play demonstrates the big gulf between master and servant in the time it was written or the time it represented, which again connects to the social class and a study of the different classes as exhibited in the story. Social class that becomes a major determinant in different readings of this play or any other Marxist reading.